Equal justice under law. These are the words engraved on the home of one of the most powerful institutions in America. This building is home to the Supreme Court, one of three branches of the federal government and the highest court in America. Today we know the Supreme Court for groundbreaking cases such as Obergefell v. Hodges, Roe v. Wade, and Brown v. Board of Education. But it didn't used to always be this way. In fact, near the foundation of our government, our Supreme Court was not only weak, but on the verge of disappearing, and without the efforts of John Marshall, it very likely could have. One thing that always surprises people is just how little the Constitution says about the Supreme Court. Article 3, which pertains to the Supreme Court, only contains 3 sections, and it boils down to 1. There will be a Supreme Court. 2. These are the cases the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction over. And 3. This is what treason is. The only sense of what the framers originally intended for the court is given to us in Federalist 78. The Federalist Papers were a series of 85 papers arguing in favor for the ratification of the Constitution. The Federalist Papers were written by John Jay, James Madison, and the much-beloved Alexander Hamilton. In Federalist 78, Alexander Hamilton himself says, "The judiciary is beyond comparison the weakest of the 3 departments of power." He argues that leaving the power to interpret the Constitution up to the legislature is too dangerous, and therefore that power must reside in the judiciary. But because these powers were not enumerated in the Constitution, the statements made by Alexander Hamilton were not followed, and the office of Supreme Court Justice became a laughingstock of the political world. The story begins with the election of 1800. Incumbent President John Adams, a Federalist, was running against Thomas Jefferson, a Democratic Republican. Much to the dismay of the Federalist Party, Thomas Jefferson had been elected into the White House, and they had been soundly voted out of the legislature. It looked like the end of the Federalist Party when John Adams, now a lame duck president, remembered that there are 3 branches to the federal government. He quickly created and filled several judicial positions. Luckily for him, Oliver Ellsworth, the Supreme Court Chief Justice, had just decided he wished to retire. He filled the position with a staunch Federalist, John Marshall. His appointment process went without a hitch, and he took the office in January 1801. Not all of his appointments received the same treatment as John Marshall, however.
Especially back then, the appointments were sent out at the last minute.
That's the voice of Kathy Zwitzer, currently a professor at the University of Northern Colorado. She worked teaching social sciences and AP US government and history for 29 years.
And John Marshall didn't get to them. He didn't get to sending them all out. The next president came in and refused to send them.
The court John Marshall arrived to was very different from the one we know today. For starters, it only had 6 justices, as opposed to the 9 we have now. The court did not have an official meeting room until 1931. Until then, they had been meeting in a committee room on the base floor of the Capitol building. The court had no leadership. The previous Chief Justices had spent the majority of their time on diplomatic missions for the executive branch, and very little time hearing cases. John Rutledge, the second Supreme Court Chief Justice, actively spoke out against certain measures taken by the Washington administration, and he was removed from the court for doing so. By the time John Marshall reached the court, it was thought to be a cheap partisan tool, so he attempted to distance the court from its reputation. He moved all the justices under one roof in an attempt to build camaraderie, and he even made the justices wear the long black robes we know today, as opposed to the English robes and civilian clothes. While John Marshall had been busy, so too had the other branches of government. The now Democratic-Republican-controlled legislature had repealed the Judiciary Act of 1801, which was the act that allowed John Adams to fill and create so many judgeships. They had also canceled the Supreme Court's term for the year of 1802.
Mr. Marbury did not receive his appointment to a D.C. Justice of the Peace position in the very last hours of the Adams administration. The new president, Jefferson, refused to send them as they were Federalist appointments. Marbury sued, asking for his appointment, and the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Marshall, issued their ruling.
Before Marshall made his decision on the case of Marbury versus Madison, he had to consider two things. One, if the decision he wrote was against that of the President of the United States, the President could simply choose to ignore his order and the Supreme Court would become useless and unimportant. Two, if he sided with the President, then the Supreme Court would become nothing more than the President's pawn. After hearing the arguments, Chief Justice John Marshall issued a unanimous decision. His decision asked these three questions. 1. Has the applicant a right to the commission he demands? 2. If he has a right, and that right has been violated, do the laws of his country afford him a remedy? 3. If they do afford him a remedy, is it a mandamus issuing from this court? To the first, he answered yes, because the appointment of a judge and the efficacy of a law do not depend on the physical paper, but depend on the fact that they went through the process that created it and was agreed upon by all parties involved. To the second, Marshall ruled that the government did have a responsibility to give Marbury his commission, because the government and the president are held responsible and accountable by the same laws that the rest of us are. And to the third, he responded that the nature of the writ and the power of the court meant that a mandamus from the court was the proper solution. But the real genius in Marshall's decision in Marbury versus Madison involved neither Marbury or Madison. It involved a law passed by the legislature that allowed plaintiffs to sue directly to the Supreme Court. Now, according to Section 2, Article 3 of the Constitution, the Supreme Court is exclusively an appellate court except in certain instances, and this was not one of those instances. In this decision, John Marshall used the word unconstitutional for the first time. John Marshall believed that the laws passed by the legislature come secondary to the Constitution, and because this law directly violates Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, it was invalid. In doing this, John Marshall sidesteps having to make a decision that could anger the president, and also firmly commits himself and the judiciary as an independent and official federal branch. Because John Marshall was willing to take a stand and fight for the judiciary, this country has been forever changed. Be it the civil rights movement in the 60s or the Lochner era in the early 20th century, you cannot deny the impact that judicial review has had on this country, and is still having today. Every year, major Supreme Court cases are being heard, and will continue to be heard until the end of this country.